The Oxy Gene Hypothesis. Written and created by S.R. Woodward. Chapter 1. The phone rang in the outer office attached to laboratory number 313. Before he picked it up, Brad Levis glanced through the floor-to-ceiling glass window, which separated the office from the laboratory proper. Tom Edison, Brad's research partner, was engrossed with the analysis the computer had pumped out on reams of paper. Brad knew it wasn't a good idea to disturb Tom at these times. The way Tom managed to focus on the results was astounding and usually bore fruit. Brad answered the phone.
"Brad Levers,"
he said.
"Brad, it's Julius. Can you and Tom come to my office for a moment? There's an important decision to be made, and if we play our cards right, this could be the making of the Gaia Genetics Corporation."
"Yes, sir. Of course,"
Brad replied, not having any option but to agree. Brad replaced the phone's receiver and glanced at Tom once more. He'd no idea that the decisions he was about to make would rid the Gaia Genetics Corporation, and the scientific community at large, of the genius who was Tom Edison, forevermore. Julius Randle III had a rugged outdoor look about him. He'd acquired this as an adolescent whilst working on his father's farm during the late 1940s. He'd borne witness to crop failures, through disease and poor seasonal weather, and had become determined to remove the pitfalls that often befell arable farming. In one way or another, it was something he knew he could do. His father frequently told him,
"Man is the most superior of God's creations, and if this world is going to succeed, man will, one way or another, assist and direct nature towards our prosperity. There is never a problem that man can't resolve."
Using land his father had already given him and further financial backing from the Randle legacy, he started Cropshaw. Initially, his fledgling company began selective breeding programs, crossing species of crop exhibiting traits that would be beneficial. Whether it was the land he had or a natural eye for hardy types, he'd always succeeded producing the hybrids the agricultural markets clamored for. As his company grew and the science of genetic modification began to mature, Julius Randle steered his company towards the production of GM crops and renamed the company the Gaia Genetics Corporation, a reflection of the belief his father had instilled in him as a young man. In the beginning, he was ahead of his time, and as investors became interested, so the money followed. Now it was different. The market was almost saturated with GM companies, and Julius needed something his company could offer, something that no other company could, something to place Gaia Gen, as it was colloquially known, back at the top and in front of all the rest of its competitors. A year before, through a chance meeting at a GM seminar, Julius Randle III had discovered Brad Levis as the guy attempted to network. In efforts to promote his PhD, Julius had understood the potential of Brad's work, if it could be reproduced. He'd approached Brad, and after a short discussion, Brad had been offered a research position at Gaia Gen. 12 months on, and after a few reasonable successes, Brad asked Julius for an appointment, and Gaia Gen's founder had acquiesced. Julius eyed the ebony-haired, well-coiffured, olive-skinned young man as he stood before him. He hoped he was going to be told of further developments, something that had been lacking in the last few months, but he suspected not. He suspected Brad Levis was a spent entity.
"What can I do for you, Brad?"
he'd asked at the time.
"And don't beat around the bush, I'm very busy."
"Sir, in order to make further significant steps forward, I need someone to assist me in these endeavors."
Julius hid his annoyance with his employee for reminding him of the successes he'd made.
"You're not going to sit on your laurels in this company, Mr. Levers,"
Julius had thought. But he'd allowed Brad to continue anyway. After Brad had finished explaining about a guy called Tom Edison, Julius smelt something good on the horizon. And even if the new guy brought only 8 months of research breakthroughs to Gaia Gen, he could be quietly let go, though the patents of the work would remain with the company. A week went by as Julius considered the option. He had to be sure. After careful deliberation, Julius decided to let Brad approach the man. Brad wandered along the 3rd-floor corridor and took the stairwell to the 5th as he made his way to Randle's office, curious as to what decisions his boss had been alluding to in the phone call he'd just received. Brad never used the elevators, not because of some phobia, but just because the exercise would complement his fitness regime. He liked looking good. He smiled to himself as he approached his boss's imposing office door. He knew Randle was a driven man, but for him to think that Gaia Gen needed something else to be the making of the company did amuse. Gaia Gen had many contracts with other businesses, including contracts to supply laboratory space should the need arise. its laboratories were the envy of the world. But most lucrative of all were the contracts it had with the U.S. Department of Defense. QIAGEN was not short of funds, and its $11 billion annual turnover showed just how well it was doing. Brad wondered why Randall wanted even more. Standing outside the door to the office for a second, Brad readjusted his tie, then brushed non-existent specks of dust off his jacket's shoulders, and once satisfied with his appearance, he knocked. Almost immediately there was a quiet buzz as Sylvie Usman, Randall's PA, pressed a button on her desk and unlocked the outer door to Randall's office. This was just one of the protections Julius had put in place when he'd commissioned the building, his steadfast belief he was a target of the unscrupulous GM industry, always at the forefront of his thoughts. Sylvie's office was something Randall referred to as his outer sanctum.
Afternoon, Sylvie.
Brad said as he entered.
I've come.
I know.
Sylvie said, as she interrupted QIAGEN's lead researcher.
He's expecting you. Go through.
Brad walked past Sylvie's desk and through the stained oak door into Julius's office, the inner sanctum.
Brad,
Julius said.
Please take a seat. Where's Tom?
Tom's busy on the project.
Brad said, as he sat in the large leather seat Julius had indicated.
Brad, do you want a coffee or anything?
Yes, sir, please.
Brad replied.
I wouldn't mind a drink.
Julius Randall pressed the button to his intercom, then said.
Sylvie, could you please bring in a cup of coffee for Mr. Levers, and a glass of sparkling water, for myself? Thank you.
Of course, sir.
The intercom answered. Moments later Sylvie Usman entered Randall's office carrying a tray holding the requested drinks.
That will be all, Sylvie, thank you.
Julius Randall said, taking the tray from her.
Oh, and please make sure I'm not disturbed until I've finished with Mr. Levers, okay?
As you will, Mr. Randall.
The icily cool 5 feet 8 inches ebony-skinned PA responded, and left, leaving the two men alone.
Levers, how's the research going?
Brad knew this was going to be a serious conversation. Randall only referred to his employees by their last name when the topics of discussion were going to be serious.
The research is on track as outlined in last week's report, sir.
A frown crossed Julius Randall's brow for a moment, then he smashed his fist onto the desk.
Don't mess with me, Levers. Just answer the question.
Out of all the ideas Brad had conjured up about how the meeting would go, this was not one of them.
Well, sir.
Brad said, stumbling over his words uncharacteristically.
Stop pussyfooting around, Levers.
Julius Randall interjected.
I need to know where your research stands. You do realize that QIAGEN is 3 points behind our nearest competitor on share price, and I won't have it. I'm not going to be embarrassed in this way.
Brad sighed. He had no idea why Randall was so irked. The company may well be 3 points behind the nearest competitor, but its annual revenues were nothing to be balked at. Taking a deep breath, Brad began to explain.
Sir, where we stand at this point is that we have two plant species which, when crossed, will produce a hybrid that expires oxygen with or without sunlight. However, using traditional methods of cross-fertilization, the oxygen-expiring hybrid is not guaranteed. For some reason, the gene responsible for this is not always expressed, whereas ordinarily the results are a given. Rest assured, we are looking into this problem at this point. As for the gene injection techniques using a modified plant virus, it only becomes active when saturated with ultraviolet light for prolonged periods. And that's it really, sir.
Brad decided to leave out the other problems he and Tom had been experiencing. What he had told Randall was an honest outline to his way of thinking.
Okay. You are aware that our government is more receptive to the idea of global warming, aren't you?
Of course, Mr. Randall.
Now, if you and Mr. Edison's research pans out, you do realize that QIAGEN will have one of the only biological patents that could mitigate the problem of global warming. Your project to have a plant, any plant, by genetic modification, that sequesters excess CO2 in our Earth's atmosphere, will be the making of my company.
Brad now knew the direction Julius Randall wanted to drive QIAGEN. If he and Tom could come up with viable hybrids or a method of GM to achieve this, QIAGEN would become the planet's savior. The rewards would be astronomical. Every government would want the technology they and QIAGEN were on the brink of creating.
That's correct.
Brad agreed.
I have been offered,
Julius continued,
an opportunity to test your little project as one of the scientific experiments on board NASA's new shuttle program, which launches in the new year. NASA is extremely interested in other methods to remove carbon dioxide from the International Space Station's in-cabin atmosphere. I expect your team can do this. Furthermore, as this has been the focus of your team's research, with all the money I've poured into it, I'm inclined to tell NASA we will have something for them to use. You can't imagine what this will mean for my company, and my shareholders, for that matter. You do realize that, in achieving this goal, there is a huge scope for substantial bonuses. I'm talking seven-figure sums here, levers. It's nothing to be dismissed. And with the talent in your team, I'm looking to you to take this responsibility on and deliver a positive outcome.
When is the launch, sir?
Brad queried, as he realized what this project would mean to him. Perhaps a Nobel Prize, possibly he could even retire. His heart began to beat faster as he imagined what it meant if he failed.
The slot I've been offered is in June. Can you do this?
Yes, Mr. Randall. No problem.
Brad answered, knowing that the June in question was just under a year away, but forefront in his mind were the remaining substantial hurdles within the project he was now solely responsible for.
I'm glad you said that, Brad.
Julius began to conclude.
I will inform my friend in NASA that Gaiagen will have an experiment for the new shuttle program to take into space within the year.
The meeting ended, and just as Brad was about to open the door of the inner sanctum to leave, Julius Randall said,
Brad, don't forget about the rewards this opportunity could mean to you.
Of course not, Mr. Randall. I won't.
Brad reached for the door handle once again.
Brad, and one more thing.
Yes, sir?
He said, turning back to face his boss once more.
Don't you ever forget what this will mean for my company, okay?
Now finished, Julius Randall flicked his hand and dismissed Brad without waiting for any response. Brad Levis left the office looking forward to reaping the rewards of a successful outcome, suppressing, as much as he could, what it would mean if the experiment failed. As he walked back to his lab, he wondered how he would break the news of the deadline to Tom Edison. Chapter 2.
Brad, there's no way we can possibly have a hybrid ready in time, even if we get the plant virus to work under normal conditions.
Tom informed his boss.
Tom, NASA's new shuttle program starts next year, and we're lucky to have been offered the slot in the first place. Anyway, it's a moot point. Mr. Randall has given the go-ahead.
When did you talk with him? You know our research is nowhere near complete.
Tom paused for a second, then added,
Don't bother answering, there's no point. I suppose Mr. Randall is quite happy with the idea.
Tom, firstly, Mr. Randall approached me about this opportunity. He's got friends in NASA, you know, and they gave him first refusal. We just can't miss this chance. Something like this may not come up again for a good number of years. It's a chance in a lifetime, and if it comes off, we'll be world-renowned. It's our opportunity to get our names into the history books.
Okay, Brad. But what happens if we're not ready when the time comes?
Tom, you've got to learn to be more positive. It's not good for the company if you're forever downplaying the achievements we've made. We'll address missing the target nearer the time. In the meanwhile, let's redouble our efforts and make sure we're ready when the time comes.
Brad took his coat from the lab's hanger and put it on. He was ready to go home for the weekend. He opened the laboratory's door and turned back to Tom.
Hey, Tom, don't fret about it, and have a good weekend, won't you? You look like you need it.
Yeah. Okay. Same to you, Brad. See you Monday.
Tom sighed as the lab door closed, leaving him with his thoughts. He shook his head in consternation at his colleague's attitude. Tom wondered what had happened to the cautious Brad Levis he'd known whilst studying at Cambridge University, in England. He had hooked up with Brad through one of the university's open access forums, one that was shared with other academic establishments around the world. At the time, Brad was researching his doctorate on plant supercultures, methods to accelerate plant growth rates in order to reduce the time between a plant being propagated and it attaining its full adult form. This reduction would be a boon to the already massive pharma and agrochemical industries, to say the least. It was through Yale University's Center for Biodiversity and Science-linked forum that Tom had come across Brad Levis' online conversations. Tom had been impressed with the ideas Brad had been propounding, and after a few evenings of reading what he was posting, Tom had decided to strike up a discussion with the man. In England, Tom was researching his own PhD on the genetic modification of plants through the use of plant viruses. After stumbling across the shared forum, Tom immediately saw how his and Brad Levis' research could fit hand in glove. A few months after their online conversations, they'd both finished their dissertations and had lost contact with each other soon after. Tom had struggled to find a job after university, eventually deciding to take anything on offer, and it was anything, though he'd promised himself that he wouldn't go as low as a shelf stacker. As the money his father had left him began to dwindle, Tom took the next work opportunity the job center sent him and became a dustman, collecting society's reject material. During his time as a dustman, he continued applying to all the pharmaceutical companies he could think of that were advertising available posts. However, after attending the interviews, the outcome was always the same. He was turned down, the businesses citing his lack of experience. Tom began to wonder why he'd ever gone the university route to riches in the first place. It was almost as if it was a non-starter. One afternoon, after completing his round, and having the obligatory shower following it, he turned on his PC and logged on to his email. Frowning once again at his inbox with its 167 emails, he wondered why his ISP could not filter out all the junk. He clicked on the Select All button, as he usually did, and was just about to click on Delete when he noticed one of the emails was from b_levis@giageneticscorp.com. Opening the one that had caught his eye, he read it.
Hi Tom.
It started in Brad's usual informal manner.
My UK chum, bet you weren't expecting an email from me.
Tom wasn't, and he read on.
I've managed to land myself a job with the Gaia Genetics Corporation, and I've been here a year now. They were most impressed with the work I'd been doing with accelerated plant growth, and wondered what else I could do with plants, as they've suddenly become interested in anything to do with combating global warming, since the administration here has had a change of heart. I've had a few ideas and have convinced the boss, one Julius Randall III, that if Gaia Gen is going to be able to get on this bandwagon, then you're the guy they need. You interested? I can't say anymore because the program is very hush-hush. If you'll have to come over the pond to hear the rest. What'd you say?
Tom blinked at the email, then read it again, then clicked Reply. The following week Tom Edison, a sandy-haired scruffy individual whose wardrobe consisted of t-shirts and jeans, was packing, getting ready for a week-long stay in Massachusetts, Cambridge, in fact, which he thought was a tad ironic. Gaia Gen had agreed to pay for his trip and pay for the accommodation whilst he was there. During his stay he had attended the 3 interviews that had been arranged. Not once, during any of them, was the project Brad had intimated been mentioned. Although the interviews had gone very well, Tom was completely disoriented. He hadn't seen Brad at all, he'd not even received a call from him. It was only on the morning of his departure, whilst he was packing up, getting ready to go home, he got a knock on the door to his hotel room. Tom threw his shaving kit into the open suitcase on the bed as he made his way to his room's door.
Where the bloody hell have you been?
Tom demanded on seeing the person who'd knocked.
You dragged me over here to interviews you're not part of.
He continued.
You don't even contact me. What the hell is going on?
Tom,
Brad said.
This is the way the company works. They had to make sure I wasn't prepping you in any way.
Well, thanks, Brad. Thanks for letting me know.
Tom, just calm down, will you? I've got good news.
What good news can possibly make up for the hellish week I've been through, Brad? Just tell me, will you?
Okay, Tom, I'll lay it out as it is. No embellishments.
Thank you for that, Brad. I'd appreciate it. Especially as not once did the panel mention anything you said in your email.
Tom, you got the job.
Tom's jaw sagged.
But the panel didn't mention a job. I know you alluded to it, but they didn't mention a job.
Tom, they had to make sure you were the right guy, but...
Brad said.
Oh, here we go with the buts. What's the catch, Brad?
There's no real buts apart from the fact you'll have to move to the States.
How the hell do you expect me to pay for that? I'm a dustbin man. I don't have any money to make that kind of move.
Don't worry, Tom. Gaia Gen will pay for your relocation, everything.
They'll pay for my trip, but what about where I'm going to live, my housing?
They'll pay for everything, Tom. Part of the remuneration package is housing. You won't have to worry about those costs ever again. No gas, no electric, and no rent. You will be provided for. When can you let us know your decision? There's not much time.
Give me 2 weeks, Brad. This would be a huge change for me,
Tom had said at the time. Tom recalled the moment he had decided to up sticks and make a go of it in the great US of A. An uncertainty about his decision was beginning to creep in. Brad had changed from the thoughtful university student into a confident man who always knew his mind. No thought of his was ever flawed. It seemed Brad had lost the ability for self-critique, the ability to test his theories mentally before taking any particular course of action, and Tom wondered what had happened to curtail Brad's skill in determining the right tack. However, he was here now and working for Gaia Gen, earning more money than he could have ever imagined. There was nothing for him in the UK, so he put his concerns to the back of his mind, knowing he had a job he ought to stick with. Tom tried to gee himself up. The equipment he needed was here in the lab, and even if it wasn't, he knew he could put in a requisition order, and within a few days the new hardware, or whatever was required, would arrive. The whole situation was like some kind of strange dream. It was very different from what he'd experienced in the UK. Tom powered off the lab equipment, getting ready to leave for the weekend. This time, he promised himself, he wouldn't be in on Saturday, setting up further experiments, plowing through the numbers, defining the next week's experiments. He would truly have a weekend to himself. Tom smiled at his thoughts, wishing he could turn off just like that, knowing there was a 100% chance he would be back in tomorrow, to continue the work, the opposite of Brad, in fact. Chapter 3. At the same time Brad was leaving his house for his Saturday morning's jog, Tom was getting out of a cot in lab number 314, one of Giogen's currently unused labs which also doubled for a dorm room. Against his better judgment he had worked through the night on the results the computer had finished churning out during Friday afternoon. He wanted a result as much as he knew Brad did. But by 3 a.m. he had reached his limit and was too exhausted to do any more, crashing in the spare lab. It was always a good place to crash, better than his own bedroom in fact. The labs, and their outer offices, were airtight for safety reasons. Not one sound would penetrate them, and for this reason, the rigid bed he had slept on was of no consequence. Tom rubbed his face vigorously as he walked back into lab number 313. He had to double-check the previous evening's results, just to make sure he hadn't been dreaming. If the analysis proved true, then they'd be well on the way to producing a virus, one capable of modifying the genes of Solanum tuberosum, the potato plant, resulting in a new species that would be able to produce oxygen, irrespective of its light conditions, using the available CO2 in the atmosphere or from any other potential source to do this. Tom guessed that by employing the techniques suggested by the computer analysis they'd be ready with a stable plant hybrid within the next months, if not earlier. This would then leave them enough time to prepare their pod, the one NASA's shuttle would use to take their experimental flora into space, and Julius Randle would have his wish, Giogen's contribution to NASA's gravity-free scientific studies. Saturday afternoon arrived and Tom had confirmed his interpretations of the computer data. He powered down the lab. Tom smiled to himself as he left the building. He felt a hell of a lot happier than when Brad had told him of the project's deadline. Chapter 4. Months had passed since Tom had told Brad of the results of the computer's analysis, and it was months since Tom had suffered the worst ever hangover of his entire life. When Brad had got into the office on that Monday morning after the weekend breakthrough, and Tom had told him the news, Brad had insisted that he take Tom out for the time of his life. Initially Tom had declined. Going out was not his thing. However, there had been no refusing Brad and he'd eventually complied. He'd also been persuaded to smoke a Cuban cigar for the first time in his entire life and regretted that decision almost more than he'd regretted drinking so much. They'd worked hard during the intervening time and Brad had kept Julius up to date with their progress, sending regular emails to Julius's PA, though this communication was always kept from Tom. In Brad's view, Tom had no need to know, as he wasn't really interested in the administration required to keep their project going anyway. The focus of the latter months had been on developing the plant virus, so that once introduced to the specimens the genetic modifications would occur in a matter of mere hours, rather than the 2 or 3 weeks it had been taking since Tom's initial identification of the problem. The atmosphere in lab number 313 was electric. The team had cracked the problems and the virus no longer needed to be activated through exposure to UV light. The project had now been dubbed Project Oxy Gene. The deadline was approaching, and within the next 8 weeks, Project Oxy Gene would be blasting into outer space on the shuttle Ventura. Another week had come to an end and Tom said, looking through the window into the lab containing the oxygen expiring plants.
Brad, you go home now. I've got a few little things I need to test, but I think we're finally there. We've actually done it.
Too right, we've done it. What tests were you thinking about? The way you've been these last few months, you must have invented tests that no one's ever even considered.
Brad, you know me, I just want to make sure it's in my nature.
Tom paused for a minute, then added pointedly,
Like you used to be.
Brad ignored the last comment.
I'll look forward to the results. Have a great weekend, bud.
I'm sure I will. See you Monday, Brad.
Brad left the outer office and left Tom preparing the computer for yet another run of the data they'd collected. Leaving the stairwell into the basement parking lot, he strode over to his Dodge Viper STR-10 and couldn't help rubbing his hands together thinking about the 6-figure sums Randall had promised him. Very soon he would be able to make his dreams come true. Brad started planning how he was going to spend the money. Perhaps he would even go to Las Vegas this weekend and dabble in a bit of serious gambling. It had been a long time and something he'd stopped doing after the trouble he had got into before. Chapter 5. The weekend had passed quickly, and as Brad parked his car he contemplated the thousands of dollars in cash and IOUs he'd lost in the casinos, dismissing the thoughts as quickly as they came, the worry being replaced by the notions of the money he would make because of Project Oxy Gene. Quickly he traversed the stairs to Gaia Gen's third floor and entered the lab, wondering how much further the experiment had progressed over the weekend. But then he saw Tom. Tom was disheveled, dark rings around his eyes, his sandy hair every which way.
Tom, you okay?
Brad said, frowning.
No, Brad, I'm not. And neither are we.
Tom replied in a monotone.
Why?
Brad asked, attempting to conjure up any reason why Tom would look so bad.
You haven't had a family bereavement this weekend.
He said stupidly.
You don't have a family. What's the problem, my UK chum?
There's a problem with the virus.
Tom said bluntly.
There can't be. There was nothing wrong with it on Friday. There's been nothing wrong with it for weeks. What are you talking about?
Brad felt the muscles in his neck tightening. The money he'd lost at the casino on Saturday was due soon, and he'd convinced the casino owners he was good for it. He knew what the outcome was likely to be if he didn't deliver on his promise.
The gene modification doesn't just affect plants, it affects mammalian tissue as well.
How do you know that?
Brad demanded.
I just checked to see what would happen if I placed a rat in the lab at the same time I released Project Oxy Gene. Don't know why I did, just being thorough I suppose, but I did it.
What happened?
The rat died of edema. You know, the buildup of fluids in the body cavities.
I know what edema is, Tom.
Brad's mind was in turmoil. He dragged his hand down his face as if trying to get rid of something dirty, something he had just been covered in. His panicked mind heard his voice say,
What was the cause?
Brad, I just told you. The virus strain we've created doesn't just modify plant genes, it modifies any living tissue with the right cellular structure.
How?
Brad asked as he felt his new world, his whole imagined new life, begin to disintegrate before him.
Our virus, particularly when introduced into the respiratory tract, modifies the genetic structure of the lining cells. Within 2 hours those cells start absorbing carbon dioxide as fast as they can get hold of it. Initially the rat seems to suffer hyperventilation, but once the carbon dioxide has been completely absorbed the animal is unable to survive. It just swells up, fluids filling any cavity resulting in heart attack or drowning or kidney failure. And those are just the effects I've seen. The end result is always the same though, the rat dies.
What's the problem with that? We're not going to be sending up any viruses, just the modified plants.
The problem with that is how we are going to make sure the plants we send are clear of the virus. There's really no choice, the virus has to be destroyed and we have to start over. I'm truly sorry, Brad.
A heavy sicky feeling was developing in the pit of Brad's stomach, his mind felt clouded, and his vision was beginning to tunnel. Brad cuffed a cold perspiration from his forehead.
No, Tom, that's not what we're going to do.
Brad almost barked.
What we're going to do is spend a little more time on understanding the problem. There must be an answer. Not having one is not an option.
What do you think I've been doing all this weekend, Brad? I've tried everything.
Go over them again.
Brad picked his coat up from the hanger he'd just put it on and turned to leave.
What are you doing?
Tom asked.
I'm going. You just carry on.
As Brad left, Tom shook his head in disbelief, staring at his departing colleague's back. Chapter 6. Brad paced around the underground parking lot, smacking his head intermittently with his palm, trying to force his brain to find a solution, but nothing would come. The latest results were extremely bad. There was no way he could tell Julius about this, especially as his daily reports had been more than positive, with good reason. And there was nothing he could tell the casino. Whichever way he looked at it, Project Oxy Gene had to go ahead, there was no question about it. The only remaining question was what Tom Edison would do when further tests resulted in the same awful outcomes tomorrow. Brad knew Tom was as honest as the day was long. He was not a person able to put a positive light on anything that was remotely negative. And Tom had always had the desire to inform his line management when things were going awry. It was part of his personal philosophy.
Management can only act appropriately as long as they know the full facts.
Unable to think clearly, Brad got into his car, turned the ignition, and gunned the engine as it came to life. The car's tires squealed as he left the car park, seeking any old bar, somewhere on the outskirts of town where he could unwind and figure out what to do next. Within 10 minutes he was out of the city and even the suburbs were beginning to thin. Before he knew it, he was pulling into the lot of a seedy motel whose sign touted bar and diner. Brad parked up, and the next thing he was aware of was placing an order for 2 large bourbons, both of which disappeared in less time than it had taken to order them. As the alcohol began to infuse his body, he ordered 2 more, and the barman dutifully lined them up. The bar was almost empty and dimly lit, its small windows refusing more light than they accepted. The place had a wooden floor and distinct cubby holes for those patrons who weren't really interested in socializing with anyone else. Brad downed the 3rd bourbon, and gradually he began to believe he was starting to think more clearly about the situation. There was an answer, he was sure. One thing was certain, he couldn't let Tom prematurely announce the results of the final experiments on Project Oxy Gene. There had only been 2 days' effort involved, and this wasn't enough to conclude the project was a failure. Brad finished his 4th bourbon and ordered another 2. Halfway through his 5th, a certainty began to develop in his thoughts. He decided to phone the lab and speak with Tom.
Gaia Gen.
Tom answered.
Tom, it's Brad. Can you do me a favor?
Haven't I done enough already?
Of course you have. But just this last one. Okay? Please.
Okay, Brad. What is it?
Can you work through tonight? Just try everything okay. I'll pick up the baton tomorrow. Crash out in a spare lab, lab number 314, when you're done. I'll make this up to you. I really will.
You'd better, Brad.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate what you're doing.
Brad shut off his mobile phone. Chapter 7. After the call, Brad decided it was time to leave. He quickly finished his last drink and made for the exit, convincing himself it was a good idea to pass by a liquor store on the way back to Gaia Gen. If what he was going to do next was going to work, he needed more of the fierce liquid. Brad didn't drive into the building's parking lot. He thought it'd be better if he parked up elsewhere. Sitting in his car, and after numerous swigs from the bottle and many long pauses in between, he checked his watch. It was still only 11 p.m. and he knew Tom would still be hard at it. From where he sat, he could see the lights in lab number 313 were still on, and if his plan was to succeed, he'd have to wait until they went off. Brad ran through what he was going to do. He would enter Gaia Gen through the basement parking lot and take the elevator to the 3rd floor. After that, he would have to check Tom's lab's ventilation system and correct the airflow. Once done, Brad was certain that the major obstacle stopping Project Oxy Gene from going into space would be resolved, and he would have abided by Tom's philosophical wish that management should act appropriately. He took another heavy swig from the bottle of Jack Daniels, and as the burning liquid hit the back of his throat, the realization of what he was about to do crystallized. His intoxicated mind told him this was the only way. He drank from the bottle again. 2 more hours passed before the light to the lab went off, briefly followed by a light in the adjacent lab silhouetting a man preparing for bed. Then all was dark. With adrenaline counteracting the effects of the drink on his muscles, he left the car and made his way to the elevator. As it traveled from the lower ground floor to the 3rd, Brad heard a whispering in his mind.
Are you sure this is the way to solve the problem? Yes.
He told himself, then.
Shut up!
The elevator opened and he made his way to the control room for the 3rd floor's air conditioning systems, putting on a pair of gloves before entering. The room was not one he'd ever been in before. Brad looked at the panels of switches and lights and sighed. At first glance it seemed to be just a huge wall of bulbs, dials and buttons, nothing really making any sense. But as he looked more closely, he saw certain switches were grouped together in blocks, with printed text indicating their purpose. He scanned the wall, and then saw it, Laboratory Airflow Control System. The buttons he was interested in were segregated from the rest, allowing or disallowing the flow of air between all the labs on the 3rd floor. Brad pressed a button changing the airflow between lab number 314 and lab number 313, then left, his task for the evening completed. Chapter 8. It was Tuesday morning, and just as Brad was about to leave his house for his jog before work, his phone rang. Brad was in 2 minds as to answer. He needed to go for a jog. The way he felt told him that he'd been on some kind of alcoholic bender, probably something to do with the fact that Project Oxy Gene was going to pay dividends, but he wasn't sure. The last 24 hours were a complete blur, though the occasional glimpses he got just seemed to be remnants of some peculiar nightmare, and as such, he dismissed them.
Brad Levers.
He answered as he picked up the phone.
Brad, we've been trying to reach you. There's been an accident.
Sylvie Usman said.
What kind of accident?
Brad said.
It's Tom Edison.
Before Sylvie Usman could finish her sentence, Brad asked.
What's wrong with Tom?
Brad was truly concerned.
Brad,
Sylvie said.
Tom's dead. He died in his sleep.
Brad's brow furrowed as he heard the words.
Tom died in his sleep? Why would Tom die in his sleep?
We don't know Brad, but he was found this morning by security.
Oh, God.
Brad said.
Julius wants to know whether this will affect Project Oxy Gene.
What a bastard.
Brad thought.
The project is complete, Sylvie.
He said.
All that needs to be finished is the pod the shuttle will take up. You can assure Mr. Randall that Project Oxy Gene is on track.
He finished.
Julius will be glad to hear this.
Sylvie said. Brad started to say, "Thank you, Sylvie." But the phone had already been disconnected. He couldn't face a run, so he jumped into the shower and got ready for work. Today was not going to be a good day, he was sure. The Gaiagen security chief handed Julius Randall a folder. Julius opened it and read the report summary.
Thank you, Albert, this is very useful. Leave this with me.
The chief left Randall to read the whole report. Julius smiled to himself. Obviously Levis had more balls than he'd given him credit for. As Brad drove into Gaiagen's parking lot, he noticed a police car in the visitors area. No doubt his work today would be interrupted. Brad entered his lab and knew all that had occurred could not distract him from finishing the final touches to Project Oxy Gene. Julius would be expecting the finished product very soon, and he, himself, was dependent on the financial outcome. When he had finished the work on the project, he would then be mindful of the loss of his friend and colleague, but until then his primary allegiances were to Randall, whether he liked it or not. Chapter 9. 2 months had passed since the death of Tom Edison, and it was launch day for the shuttle Ventura. The Kennedy Space Center was ready and the CEO of Gaiagen had been invited to witness the launch. Julius had told Brad Levis to join him as one of the named individuals he was allowed to invite. After arriving, they'd been taken through to mission control, and within 30 minutes the countdown had started. Brad listened to the commentary.
Okay. All flight controllers coming up on auto sequence. Booster, how you?
We're go, flight.
EECOM?
Go, flight.
GNC?
Go, flight.
Telcom?
Go, flight.
Control?
Go.
Network, got it there?
That's affirmative, flight.
Okay.
With the sequence complete, Ventura left the launch pad aiming for near-Earth orbit. Once there, the crew would activate all the zero-gravity experiments, the ones that had been paid for by a myriad of corporations, not forgetting the government's own agencies. After the launch, Julius Randall turned towards Brad.
What do you think, Levers? How are we going to do in space?
I think when the shuttle crew activates our experiment, NASA will be more than pleased.
Chapter 10.
Houston. Do you copy?
Ventura's commander asked, as it changed between control centers.
That's an affirmative, Ventura.
The controller replied.
Are we ready to go with Project Oxy Gene?
Commander Eileen Lawrence requested.
That's an affirmative, Ventura. Go with Oxy Gene.
Gaiagen's pod was opened in the shuttle's onboard laboratory. Dr. Jeannie Malik was the technician responsible for this particular experiment, and she monitored the CO2 levels. To her surprise, the carbon dioxide in the lab reduced dramatically, and very quickly. Jean turned to the commander.
I've registered a 5% reduction in CO2 levels already. These plants could be the making of space travel.
Please check your stats, Doctor. We can't be bringing back false results. The companies that have funded this research are relying on us.
Double-checked them already, ma'am. The results are correct.
Jeannie Malik responded, removing her helmet.
Okay, Jean. Let's see what power we can save using these plants.
Affirmative, Commander. Opening lab ingress and shutting off CO2 recycler.
Dr. Malik flicked the appropriate buttons and started to measure the level of CO2 in the shuttle's primary control area.
Commander, Project Oxy Gene is go and functional.
Affirmative, Doctor. Good news. Let's see how long we can run with this.
The GM plants were working. The rest of the crew removed their helmets and carried on with their tasks. Project Oxy Gene sequestered the CO2 and released vital, life-giving oxygen. Jeannie Malik began to frown. For some reason she was beginning to feel disoriented. Her head was fuzzy. She clicked on her intercom and addressed the shuttle's commander.
Commander, what's your CO2 reading?
Good, Doctor. CO2 levels are just below normal.
Okay, sir. Sorry. I mean, ma'am.
She said, correcting herself. The dormant virus spores that had traveled on Gaiagen's plants were now circulating around the command module and were becoming active, the 0G of space assisting them in their mutations. As long as the virus found moist and living tissue, wherever it landed, it began its work, modifying the genetic structure of the cells, repurposing them. No one had considered the possibility of the virus being able to cross species barriers, let alone being able to jump between plant and animal kingdoms. Dr. Malik began to hyperventilate and knew that breathing into a bag would control the problem. She opened one of Ventura's lockers, taking a bag from it and putting it to her mouth. She breathed in and out, waiting for the discomfort to subside. Her eyes widened with fear as she breathed harder and faster into the bag with no effect. The virus in her lungs was mutating her cells, and as it did so it multiplied, feasting on the extra CO2, turning the doctor into an envoy of death. The ventricles in Dr. Malik's brain, those empty spaces, began to fill with fluid, forcing her cranial tissues outwards. She almost had time to grasp her head as searing pain lanced its way through, and as death took her a final spasm in one of her legs, launched her lifeless cadaver through the air towards the back of the laboratory. Blood-spotted grey matter seeping from her nose in rivulets, as if from some kind of head-shaped ice cream machine. The shuttle's commander looked back at the doctor, whose body was now slowly spinning in the shuttle's gravity-free environment, trying to understand what was happening and what the pinkish-colored gunk was around the doctor's mouth. She handed control to the shuttle's co-pilot and got up from her seat, floating herself through the opening into the lab. Just as she reached for one of the hand grabs, she began to cough uncontrollably. Her lungs felt as if they were filling with water, and incapable of catching her breath, she lost consciousness. It was the same for the rest of Ventura's crew, all attempting to assist the fallen, but dying of edema before they could. Even the last member who had the wherewithal to put his helmet back on died of a heart attack. The awareness that something was terribly wrong came too late. He'd already breathed the shuttle's virus-polluted atmosphere. As the CO2 level began to drop to zero, the virus that had traveled all that way, and its host cells, died, neither of the new minute life forms being capable of surviving without CO2 to feed on. The newly silent shuttle orbited the Earth with the silence only occasionally broken by panicked squawks from the shuttle's radio, mission control attempting to contact the dead crew. Chapter 11. In mission control it was decision time. Bring down the shuttle under remote control or wait until there was a response. The mission controller didn't like the choices.
Go with remote landing,
he instructed, knowing that as the shuttle penetrated the Earth's atmosphere all contact would be lost, including the ability to control the shuttle's flight during this time. It was a dangerous endeavor. The Ventura space vehicle received the commands from mission control, and it started its descent. All the technicians sighed with relief when they regained control of the spacecraft as it finished its entry into Earth's atmosphere. The best landing site available was White Sands, and the craft was directed to land there. As the shuttle's nose wheel was slowly maneuvered down to the landing strip's surface, a sudden and strong crosswind pushed the craft sideways and the wheel touched down on the rough natural surface, missing the landing strip by a few feet. The wheel hit a pothole and the jarring force buckled the nose wheel's load-bearing struts. The front of the craft fell onto the rough surface and the command module bore into the ground, throwing ceramic tiles and earth up into the air as the speed and weight of the shuttle pulverized the hard surface. As inertia continued to force the shuttle forward, a rending crack rang out as the craft's spine gave way, the shuttle skin tearing behind the command module's compartment. Sparks from the now broken electronics ignited the pure oxygen atmosphere of the crew area, and there was a momentary silent blinding flash before orange flames and a deafening explosion reduced the front part of the spacecraft to fast-flying black and white torn sections of composite material. Debris rained down everywhere, lifeless spacesuited bodies ejected across the runway, experimental pods vaporized. Finally, the shuttle's right wing sunk into the Earth next to the landing strip and sent the remains of the craft's body cartwheeling, wing over wing, completing its destruction. It was a disaster, the like of which had not been seen since the Columbia tragedy. Chapter 12. Brad was at home watching the news, waiting for Guygen and his experiment to be announced as the first major scientific breakthrough in the 21st century, but that was not what he got. He fell into his chair as CNN delivered its commentary on the shuttle's fatal landing. Julius Randle was also watching the evening news, and as the pictures of the smashed shuttle faded back to the newscaster, he turned the television off and picked up a cheap and unused pay-as-you-go mobile phone from his desk. After a few words, he walked into his kitchen and dropped the phone into his garbage disposal unit, and when it had finished its business, he took the garbage out ready for tomorrow's collection. Entering his lounge, he poured himself a malt whiskey and sat down, turning on his chess computer to finish a game he had started a few months ago. After a few hours of playing, the computer had finally got the better of him and he turned in for the night. Unlike Julius Randle's moderated drinking, Brad Levis, directly after the CNN newscast, had gone to his drinks cabinet, not even contemplated using a glass, and had begun to guzzle bourbon straight from the bottle as his television continued to blast news reports about the accident at him. He sat in his leather chair just staring at the TV pictures, shaking his head, muttering "no, no, no" under his breath between swigs. A sudden banging at his front door startled him from his almost hypnotic trance the never-ending scenes of carnage had put him in. He got up unsteadily, finding it difficult to drag his gaze away from the TV pictures as he walked over to his front door. Pulling the door open, he squinted his eyes twice, trying to focus, trying to recognize the unexpected visitor.
Mr. Levers.
Guygen's bulky chief of security started, in a firm but calm tone.
I recognize you, don't I?
Brad said, looking at the person on his doorstep, more than the worse for wear.
Yes, you do, Mr. Levers.
It's
Albert.
The chief of security finished for him.
Did you see?
Brad began, pointing back at the TV.
Yes, Mr. Levers.
The chief interjected.
And if you could hand me that bottle.
The chief continued, indicating the bourbon Brad was holding.
Then I can take you to the office, as Mr. Randle needs to discuss some urgent matters with you.
Brad handed the gloved security chief his bottle of bourbon.
You need some shoes, Mr. Levers.
Oh yes, of course I do.
Brad replied, pulling his hand down his face, attempting to sober up a little. Brad walked back into his house and the security chief followed, making his way to the television set, turning it off and picking up a box of Cuban cigars that Brad always kept for special occasions.
If you would like, Mr. Levers, I could drive you in your car.
Why not, Albert?
Brad took his keys from his jeans pocket and handed them to the chief. Brad put his shoes on, and the security chief helped him to his car, checking the road as they made their way. The chief smiled to himself. It was night, and the road was devoid of motorists and people. The chief pulled into the underground parking lot of the Gaia Genetics Corporation. Killing the engine, the chief got out and made his way around to the passenger's side, opening the door for Brad. Brad pulled himself out of the car by placing a hand on each side of the door. He was still very drunk.
This way, Mr. Levers.
The chief said when the elevator stopped on the 3rd floor.
Are we going to Mr. Randle's office?
No, he wants to meet you in your office. Probably to go over some details of the project.
Brad and the security chief entered the office of lab number 313. The main light wasn't on, and when the security chief tried the switch, nothing happened. The chief made his way to Brad's desk and switched on the table lamp, accidentally knocking a project folder onto the floor next to the desk. As the security chief bent over to pick up the folder, he let out an anguished groan and quickly stood up straight again, immediately rubbing the small of his back.
Sorry, Mr. Levers, could you pick up that folder? My back's playing up so much tonight.
Sure, Albert.
Brad bent down, reaching for the folder, and as he did so, the security chief gritted his teeth, summoning all his strength, his back being a problem no more, and using his full weight he viciously pushed the back of Brad's head, smashing the man's forehead down against the edge of the desk. Brad crumpled to the floor unconscious. Chapter 13. It was 2 a.m. when he was roused from his sleep by his insistent phone. He picked it up.
Randle,
he said.
Sir, this is the police department. I'm afraid I have some bad news.
What is it, officer?
There's been a fire at your premises. It seems that it started on the 3rd floor, but spread.
Has anyone been hurt?
Randall said with mock concern.
So far there's only been one body found, but it's too badly burnt to identify at the moment. Also, there's a car in the lot that may be helpful to have identified.
Okay. You carry on, officer. I'll be there as soon as I can.
Randall replaced the receiver, knowing that whatever had happened, Gaiogen's insurance company would pick up the bill and he would be able to start afresh once the paperwork had been completed. He smiled as he recalled his father's words from his youth. There is never a problem that man can't resolve, and so far, he'd found that to be true.